Okay, let's talk a little bit about a different kind of topic. Let's talk about forecasting. And the reason for this chapter, the reason for this analysis, when you think about the title of our book, we're talking about entrepreneurial finance. One of the things that we have to be able to do in making financial decisions, in planning for the future, is by definition, then, we need to be able to forecast what we think is going to happen in the future. Now, as a sidebar, all forecasts, by definition, since they're predictions, all forecasts are wrong, right? So we need to monitor our decisions. If we make choices based on our forecasted data, as events occur, we need to come back and we need to review the forecasting numbers that we've generated. We need to make some changes as we work our way through the business cycle. We may have to make some changes. So a forecast is an estimate. Forecasting in business is the process of estimating things like demand for products and services. Forecasting for financial managers talks about managing or forecasting interest rates. Forecasting for managers and investors and creditors has to do with forecasting the financial statements moving forward in the business's life. So the process is we need to figure out what kind of model is best to use for our forecasting purposes. What's the horizon? How far out should we be forecasting? We need to select one of these models, evaluate the model, apply the model. And as I mentioned, this is a constant process of monitoring, controlling, and making some revision and changes. So, how do we determine what type of model to use, right? We need to ask questions, right? Who's going to be using this data, right? What kind of information are they going to want, right? Is historical data even relevant, right? How should we use that financial or that historical data? How accurate do we need to be, right? What is the time period, right? How much time do we have to develop this thing? Is the information so important we need to know it right now? That can have an impact on the kind of data and the kind of model we choose. What is the cost or benefit, right? What is the value of the forecast to the company, right? How is this going to help us in the end? So to determine the forecasting horizon, we need to ask some very basic questions. The horizon is an inverse relationship to accuracy. The more accurate you need to be, the shorter the time horizon must be. So in other words, the longer the time horizon, the more chances, the more likely that your forecast is going to have error in it. So the time horizon has to be at least as long as your strategic plan is. However, we obviously know that we make changes in strategic plan as we go along. Maybe the horizon has something to do with the product life cycle of our business, right? Technological products are going to have very short forecasts, where some other products, like they mentioned milk here, right? They're going to have a very long forecast because the demand, right? The demand structure for that is just, it has a different structure, if you will. So how do we ultimately then evaluate these models? We want to look at accuracy. One of the things we use with respect to accuracy is something called the mean absolute deviation. In other words, what is the difference between what's happening and what our forecast predicts, right? This is going to help us as we go along figure out whether or not our model is correct, whether or not the time horizon is correct. But the changing world around us is going to require us to constantly look at our models and make changes as we go along. Of course, then we have to apply the model, right? We have to figure out how we're going to physically do this. What's the process of gathering the data, putting it into the model itself? So this really is dependent on who needs the data. The marketing part of the company wants information on product demand. Production, they need information on the units that are required. Finance needs information on the dollars that are required. Personnel is going to need information about the human resources that are going to be needed in the future. So all of these models, right, they're all going to have different kinds of units, if you will, and it's all based on the type of business and the types of questions we're asking. And of course, in the end, we just have to monitor this. We have to have some process to measure how we're doing. So we need to determine a standard of progress. What is it that we expect to get? How accurate do we want to be? We need to measure the actual performance, right? We need to figure out whether we're meeting those metrics that we've set. And of course, when we go astray, we need to take some corrective actions. So again, as long as the model's providing us with good data, we continue to use it. However, we again need to be cognizant that from time to time, because of changes in the structure of the data, the economy itself, the people who need our data, the things that they want may change. We may ultimately have to go to a new forecasting model should something happen that makes this model now not as effective. There are three basic types of models. Judgmental models, these are going to use qualitative kinds of information. Time series models are going to use quantitative numbers, and causal models are going to be models that are created that utilize some type of cause and effect methodology. So let's first talk about judgmental models. There are many of these. Most of them are kind of like surveys, right? We can survey sales force, survey customers, might be able to do some market research, but in the end, market research has a lot to do with surveys. So essentially, we're asking opinions of someone, whether they be customers or suppliers, or we're asking questions, right? But this is judgmental kinds of models. They give us an information about how the world is currently seeing the world. Time series model basically uses historical data. And for this reason, we often look at internal things, right? We want to look at numbers from within the company. And again, one of the basic time series forecasting models basically says, look, past sales are fairly accurate predictor of future sales, right? The assumption of time series is that the data we're looking at has some predictive ability in the thing that we're trying to forecast. And there are several types of these time series models. Something called a moving average, a weighted moving average, an exponential smoothing model, and a linear regression model. Now, we're only going to talk about a few of these, but there are several models that we ultimately can use. So when you think about time series, right, since we're using data, we need to understand what the variables are. The A in our model is the actual observation, and the F is the forecast. T is time. Delta, this triangle here, is the difference between two numbers, right? So delta AF would be the actual observation minus the forecast. The sum of the numbers, right? The sigma here represents summing numbers up, and N is the number of observations. So again, if it's months, right, it's 12 months in a year. It could be 10 years if it's a decade, right? So that's essentially how the variables are going to be identified. So the moving average model assumes that the sales price in the past is a good predictor of the future. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick a time period, let's say 2 years, and we're going to calculate a monthly number every month for 2 years. That gives us 24 data points. We're going to use that as our model. So let's say every 24 months, we have a calculation that gives us the average. So here's a better example. Let's say we use 3 months, right? So we're going to use the first 3 months of the year, essentially. So here you have the 3 years. The numbers were 245, 244, 250. So the average is 246.33. That is the forecast for April is based on the 3 previous, January, February, March. That's the forecast for April. What's the forecast for March? Well, you'd have, for May, you'd end up having February plus what actually happened here in March. Plus then we'd also have the actual number from April. Take those 3 numbers, divided by 3, gives you the moving average. And what this does is it gives us a smoothing process, if you will, that allows us to calculate and graph this number. And as we go through this process, we'll look at this. The next slide here, there's actually two videos. Again, they're not terribly long. I think they're around 10 minutes or so. But I think they're kind of insightful to give you a little bit of a different picture, a little bit of somebody else telling the same story of the differences between simple moving averages and weighted moving averages. In the next video, we'll actually look at how we can calculate that and how we can physically do that using a spreadsheet. So that is part 1 of forecasting.